The jungle was restless that night. A heavy mist curled between the ancient trees, weaving through gnarled roots and thick undergrowth, like ghostly fingers searching for something lost. The distant cries of nocturnal creatures echoed through the darkness, but there was something unnatural in the air, a tension, a whisper of danger carried on the wind. Deep in the heart of this untamed wilderness, hidden beneath a dense canopy of emerald leaves, a shadow moved. It was swift, sleek, and nearly silent, its muscular form blending perfectly with the obsidian night. A black panther, powerful, majestic, and built for the hunt. But something was wrong. The great cat's stride was unsteady. Its paws, normally precise and deliberate, faltered as it weaved through the jungle as if drunk on some invisible poison. Its breath came in ragged bursts, and its glossy black coat, once the very image of strength and elegance, was now dull and marred by patches of matted fur. Its golden eyes, once sharp enough to pierce the night, were clouded with pain. It should have been the ruler of this domain, the silent phantom of the jungle that no prey ever saw coming. But now it was weak, vulnerable, hunted. And it didn't even know it. Miles away, a rescue team was already mobilizing. They didn't know the full extent of the danger yet, but they had received the call, an anonymous tip about a panther behaving strangely, its usual stealth and grace replaced with erratic movements and unnatural aggressions. Local villagers had spotted it near their farms, slinking through the edges of human civilization. Something wild and broken in its eyes. Veteran wildlife rescuer Daniel Carter gripped the steering wheel of the off-road vehicle as they tore through the jungle path, mud spraying up in thick waves. His heart pounded, not just from the urgency of the situation, but from a sinking feeling in his gut. He had seen big cats sick before, but something about this case felt different. The reports of its movements, the way it was described, this wasn't just an injury or illness. Something was inside that animal. Beside him, Dr. Emily Vasquez, a leading wildlife veterinarian, flipped through her notes, trying to piece together what they were dealing with. If it's behaving erratically, it could be rabies, she said, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Or a neurological issue. Poisoning is another possibility if it's been scavenging near human settlements. Daniel nodded, but said nothing. He knew that in the wild, animals didn't just stumble into sickness like this, not unless something had gone very, very wrong. The deeper they drove into the jungle, the heavier the air became. It wasn't just the humidity, it was the feeling of being watched. And they were. Back in the darkness, the panther struggled on, its body betraying it with every agonizing step. Something writhed beneath its skin, hidden in the shadows of its sleek black fur. Tiny invaders, unseen to the naked eye, burrowed deep, feasting, multiplying. The beast shuddered, its muscles spasming involuntarily. It let out a low, guttural growl, half in rage, half in pure misery. It was losing control. The parasites were winning, and time was running out. The jungle loomed taller, darker, and more suffocating as the rescue team pressed deeper into its heart. The tires of their off-road vehicle crunched over damp earth, the scent of moss and decaying leaves thick in the air. Daniel Carter's grip on the wheel tightened as he navigated the narrow path, his mind racing through the possible causes of the panther's suffering. His career had taken him to some of the most dangerous corners of the world, rescuing animals from poachers, traffickers, and the relentless march of human expansion. But something about this case made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The reports were vague, the descriptions inconsistent. Some villagers claimed the panther had been unusually aggressive, while others swore it had looked sluggish, confused, almost lost. That contradiction didn't sit right with him. Beside him, Dr. Emily Vasquez scribbled furiously in her notebook, glancing up every few moments to check the GPS on her phone. She had seen plenty of sick animals before, but this level of erratic behavior in a top predator was rare. big cats didn't just wander into human settlements unless something had driven them there. Was it desperation? Hunger? Or something far worse? She glanced at Daniel, studying his tight jaw and furrowed brow. They had worked together for years, traveling to remote areas, patching up wounded wildlife, and sometimes even coming face to face with poachers who had more bullets than morals. She had seen him calm in situations where most would panic, but right now, there was something unspoken in his silence. As the vehicle bounced over uneven terrain, Daniel's mind drifted back to the last time he had been in this part of the jungle. 6 months ago, he had worked on a case involving illegal hunting rings that were targeting jaguars and pumas for their pelts. The operation had been swift, brutal, and necessary. Several arrests had been made, and a handful of animals had been saved, but he knew better than to think the fight was over. Wildlife crime didn't just stop, it adapted. Could this panther have been a victim of that underground trade? Had it escaped from a trafficker's grasp, carrying some unknown disease or poison? Or was it something worse, something no one had seen before? A crackle of static broke through the tense silence as their radio came to life. "You guys seeing this?" The voice belonged to Marcus Hill, the third member of their team, who was following on a dirt bike a few miles behind them. His tone was sharp, edged with unease. "I just found tracks. They're weird. Not just the panthers." Daniel exchanged a look with Emily before grabbing the radio. "Weird how?" A brief pause, then Marcus responded, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. "Like it wasn't alone. I see prints from a big cat, yeah, but there's something else. Smaller, erratic, like whatever was with it didn't know how to walk straight." Daniel frowned, his foot easing off the gas slightly. "Human?" Another pause. "Maybe. But if it is, they're not moving right. It's like they're dragging their feet, stumbling." A chill crawled up Daniel's spine. The jungle had its share of dangers, but this was something different. A sick panther was one thing, a panther traveling with something else, something that didn't move naturally, was another. Emily glanced out the window, her mind whirling with possibilities. Could an infection have jumped species? A mutated strain of a known parasite affecting both animals and humans? If that was the case, they needed to be careful. Contagions in the wild were unpredictable, and the last thing they needed was an outbreak. The road narrowed, forcing them to slow down as the thick foliage closed in around them. Every shadow felt heavier now, every rustling leaf a potential threat. Somewhere ahead, the panther was out there, suffering, fighting against whatever was tearing it apart from the inside. But it wasn't alone, and that meant neither were they. As the jungle swallowed them deeper, the mystery only thickened. What had infected this panther? What was leaving those strange tracks alongside it? And perhaps, most disturbingly, who or what had sent that anonymous tip in the first place? Because if someone had been watching this panther, they hadn't stepped in to help. They had just waited. And that was never a good sign. The jungle seemed to close in tighter as they pressed forward, the thick canopy overhead blotting out most of the moonlight. The headlights of the vehicle cut through the darkness in narrow beams, illuminating twisted roots and massive ferns. But beyond that, everything remained a shifting mass of shadows. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't Marcus. It was nothing, just static. Daniel adjusted the dial, frowning as the signal faded in and out, like something was interfering with it. The uneasy feeling in his gut deepened. They had been driving for almost an hour now, following the general direction of the last sighting, but something felt off. No fresh tracks, no signs of movement, just an unsettling silence that didn't belong in a jungle teeming with life. It was as if everything around them was holding its breath, waiting. Emily's fingers drummed against her notebook, the only sign of her growing nerves. "Something's wrong," she murmured, more to herself than to Daniel. "We should have seen something by now." Just as she finished speaking, the engine sputtered. A choking sound, a violent jerk, and then silence. The headlights flickered, then died, plunging them into darkness. Daniel muttered a curse under his breath and turned the key again. Nothing. The vehicle was completely dead. Emily shot him a look. "Tell me that's just bad luck." Daniel didn't answer right away. The timing was too perfect, too precise to be coincidence. He reached for the radio again, trying to contact Marcus, but all he got was static. "Something's jamming our signal," he muttered, his voice tight. "Or someone." Before Emily could respond, a low, distant sound rippled through the trees. It wasn't the growl of a panther. It was softer, more unnatural, a wet, labored wheezing, like something trying to breathe through shattered lungs. It came from somewhere beyond the trees, shifting through the thick undergrowth. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Emily exhaled slowly. "We need to move. If the panther's close, it might be in worse condition than we thought." Daniel nodded, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment and slinging his rifle over his shoulder, not to use, but to have, just in case. They stepped out of the vehicle, the jungle floor damp beneath their boots. The air was thick with moisture, heavy with the scent of rotting vegetation, and something else, something metallic. Blood. They moved carefully, scanning their surroundings. Every sound, every shifting branch, made their pulses quicken. And then they saw it. A few feet ahead, partially buried in the undergrowth, was a tracking collar. Emily crouched down, brushing away the damp leaves. The device was old, but still functional, its metal surface scratched as if something had tried to claw it off. A sick feeling twisted in Daniel's stomach. He recognized it. This collar had belonged to a different panther, one they had tagged over a year ago as part of a conservation study. But that animal had vanished months ago, its signal lost without explanation. And yet, here was its collar, torn off and discarded, like a useless relic. Emily looked up at Daniel, eyes wide with realization. "This doesn't make sense. How did it get here?" Before he could answer, a rustling sound came from behind them. A figure emerged from the trees, stepping into the faint glow of their flashlights. It was Marcus, his expression tense, his breathing uneven. But something was wrong. His face was pale, his clothes were damp with sweat, and his pupils were blown wide. "They know we're here," he whispered hoarsely. Daniel stiffened. "Who?" Marcus swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something to lunge from the darkness. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we need to leave. Now." Emily stood slowly, still holding the tracking collar. "Marcus, what happened?" He hesitated for just a second too long. And then, from somewhere in the jungle, that same unnatural wheezing sound came again. Closer this time. Closer than it should have been. Daniel's instincts screamed at him. They weren't alone. And whatever was out there wasn't just watching them anymore. It was coming. The jungle seemed to pulse around them, the shadows shifting like something alive, breathing, waiting. Marcus stood rigid, his sweat-slicked face pale in the dim light of their flashlights. His hands trembled slightly, barely noticeable, but Daniel caught it. Whatever he had seen, or whoever he had encountered, had shaken him in a way nothing ever had before. Marcus wasn't the type to scare easily. He had been through worse than most, seen things that would haunt ordinary men for a lifetime. Yet here he was, eyes darting between the trees, like he expected something to lunge out at any moment. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Emily, her fingers still curled tightly around the discarded tracking collar. This wasn't just about the panther anymore. Something else was happening, something bigger, and they were in the middle of it without even knowing what it was. A branch snapped somewhere to their left, sharp and deliberate. Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle, his body tensing as his mind calculated the worst possibilities. They couldn't see anything beyond the limited reach of their flashlights, but that sound hadn't been an accident. Someone was here. Watching. Waiting. Marcus exhaled shakily, finally stepping forward, lowering his voice. I was tracking the prints, like I told you. The panthers, plus the weird ones alongside it. But I wasn't alone. Someone else was out there. He paused, shaking his head like he still couldn't believe what he was about to say. I don't know who they were, but they left something for me. Right in the middle of the trail, like they wanted me to find it. Daniel's jaw clenched. What did they leave? Marcus hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. It was damp from the jungle air, the edges curling slightly, but the ink on the front was still perfectly legible. 3 words, written in an unsteady but unmistakable hand. Stop looking now. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and Daniel felt a fresh wave of unease settle over him like a cold fog. He had seen plenty of warnings in his time, threats from poachers, from illegal hunters, from the kind of men who didn't want people like him interfering in their business. But this wasn't some generic intimidation attempt. Whoever had left this had been close. Close enough to know where they were headed, close enough to know Marcus would be the one to find it. That meant they weren't just stumbling into this mystery by accident. They were being led into it. Emily took the envelope from Marcus carefully, flipping it over. There's something inside. Daniel watched as she tore it open, pulling out a small folded piece of paper. As she unfolded it, her expression changed from confusion to something colder, more unsettled. She turned the paper so they could all see. It was a photograph. An old one, grainy, the colors slightly faded, but the details were still clear. It was a picture of a man standing in front of a caged animal, a panther. But not just any panther. The scars along its flank, the distinctive shape of its ears. Daniel recognized it instantly. It was the same panther they were trying to save. Only this picture had to be years old. And the man standing next to it? Daniel's stomach twisted, because he recognized him too. His name was Dr. Alan Reeves, a biologist who had vanished over a year ago without a trace. He had been leading a private research expedition deep in the jungle, studying the effects of environmental changes on large predators. Then one day, his communications had simply stopped. No distress signal, no final transmission. The rescue teams that had gone looking for him found only an abandoned camp, his equipment left behind as if he had just stepped away and never returned. Most assumed he had fallen victim to an accident or been taken by poachers. His body was never found. And yet, here he was, in a photograph someone had left for them, standing next to their panther, alive and well. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. How is this possible? Marcus took a step back, his hands resting on his hips, as he let out a slow, controlled breath. Either this picture is fake, he said, though even he didn't sound convinced, or we've been lied to about what happened to Alan Reeves. Daniel turned the photograph over, half expecting another message, another warning. But the back was blank, except for a date. Scrawled in the same uneven handwriting as the front of the envelope. 12 days ago. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. If this date was real, if this photo was real, then Alan Reeves wasn't just alive. He was in the jungle with them. And for some reason, someone wanted them to stop before they found him. The jungle no longer felt like just a place, it felt like a presence. Something vast and suffocating that had been waiting for them all along. The photograph in Daniel's hands felt heavier than paper had any right to be, like it carried the weight of something much bigger, much darker than they had realized. If Alan Reeves had truly been alive just 12 days ago, that meant everything they thought they knew about his disappearance had been a lie. But that wasn't what scared Daniel the most. What terrified him, deep in the marrow of his bones, was the fact that someone had wanted them to find this. Someone had led Marcus straight to this warning, left it in his path like bait in a trap. And now that they had taken the bait, there was no turning back. A thick wave of nausea rolled through him, but he pushed it down, his instincts screaming for control. Emily clutched the photograph, her fingers tight around the edges, as she stared at it, like it might change under her gaze. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured, shaking her head. If Reeves was alive 12 days ago, why hasn't he reached out? Why hasn't anyone heard from him? And why would someone warn us about him? Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Maybe because we're not supposed to find him," he said, his voice strained. "Or maybe because someone else already did." A gust of wind pushed through the trees, rustling the canopy high above them, but the sound did nothing to soothe the thick silence pressing in. The jungle wasn't supposed to be this quiet. It was never this quiet. The air had weight now, heavy with the feeling of being watched, a sensation Daniel had long since learned to trust. He scanned the darkness beyond the tree line, flashlight beam flicking over twisted branches and thick vines. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound, but he could feel it. Eyes. Somewhere, just beyond what the light could reach. The radio on his belt crackled suddenly, a burst of static that made Emily flinch. Daniel grabbed it, pressing the call button. "Marcus, is your signal back?" No response. Just more static. Daniel pressed again, voice steady but edged with unease. "Marcus, do you copy?" Still nothing. But then through the distortion, just for a second, something else broke through. A sound that wasn't just interference. It was breathing. Not his. Not Marcus's. Something else. Ragged, wet, too close. A single, shuddering exhale, like someone or something was right next to the microphone. Then the radio went dead. Marcus stiffened beside him, his jaw clenched so tightly, Daniel could see the muscle twitch in the dim light. "That wasn't me," he said, voice low. "That wasn't me on the other end." A fresh spike of adrenaline shot through Daniel's chest, but he didn't let it show. He glanced at Emily, whose knuckles had gone white around the photograph. "We need to move," he said. "Now." They turned back toward the vehicle, pushing through the tangled undergrowth faster than before, the sense of urgency thickening with every step. But when they reached the clearing, Daniel's pulse stopped cold. The vehicle was gone. Not wrecked. Not stripped apart. Not broken down. Just gone. The ground where it had been was churned up with tire tracks, like it had been dragged away, but there was no sound of an engine, no indication of where it had gone. No one could have just stolen it in that short amount of time, not without them hearing it. And yet, it was simply missing. Emily let out a sharp breath, barely above a whisper. "What the hell is happening?" Daniel turned in a slow circle, trying to force his mind into logic, into reason. This was impossible. The only road out of here was the one they had come in on, and they would have heard if someone had driven away. That meant either someone or something had taken it without making a sound, or they had never been alone to begin with. Then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, something gleamed. A reflection in the moonlight. Daniel's stomach dropped as he stepped closer, bending down to pick it up. It was Emily's notebook, the one she had been holding not even 10 minutes ago. His mouth went dry. He looked at Emily, who was already patting her pockets, confusion twisting into panic. "I had that," she said, voice tight. "I had that in my hands." Daniel's grip tightened around the worn pages. It wasn't just dropped. It had been placed here, deliberately. Someone had been close enough to take it from her. His breath came slower, measured, forcing himself to think. Someone was playing with them. Someone was making it clear that they had the upper hand. But why? Why not just stop them outright? Why leave cryptic warnings, stolen notebooks, and eerily placed photographs? Unless his stomach twisted, unless this wasn't about scaring them off, it was about drawing them in. And they had walked right into it. Daniel stood frozen, gripping Emily's notebook like it was the last real thing in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. The jungle pressed in around them, thick and humid, the air charged with something unseen, but undeniably there. The weight of everything, the missing vehicle, the stolen notebook, the eerie breathing on the radio, settled deep into his gut, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. A voice came from behind them, low, deliberate, and far too calm for the situation. "You should have left when you had the chance." Daniel whipped around, rifle raised, but what he saw sent a cold, numbing shock through his entire body. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the shadows, was a man. His face was partially obscured by the darkness, but as he stepped forward, the dim light revealed him clearly. It was Alan Reeves. Alive. But something was wrong. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and slick with sweat, his clothes torn and filthy, like he had been out here for far longer than 12 days. His eyes, once sharp and full of intellect in the photos Daniel had seen, now held something else. Something fractured. Something haunted. He looked both relieved to see them and deeply regretful at the same time, like he had been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. Emily took an unconscious step back, her breath hitching. "Dr. Reeves." The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, his gaze settling on Daniel with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Then, in a voice that barely sounded like his own, Reeves spoke again. "You need to stop looking for the Panther." Daniel's mind raced, trying to connect the impossible. Reeves had vanished over a year ago. No body, no trace, no answers. And yet, here he was, standing in front of them, alive but changed. The photo was real. He had been with the Panther. But if he was alive, then where had he been? And why the hell was he warning them away? Marcus stepped forward, his usual bravado tempered by raw confusion. "What the hell is going on, man? We thought you were dead." Reeves let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "I should be." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, Daniel saw the flicker of something deeper, something close to fear. "I should be, but I'm not. And if you stay here, neither will you. You think you're tracking an animal? You're wrong. You're walking into something you don't understand." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Then make us understand." Reeves exhaled sharply, looking at the ground, as if he were debating how much to say. His hands twitched, slightly nervous or trembling. Daniel couldn't tell. Finally, he looked up, his voice lower now, urgent. "The Panther didn't just get sick," he said. "It wasn't a natural infection. It was altered." The words hit like a gunshot in the silence. Daniel felt the weight of them immediately, but Emily was the first to react. "What do you mean, altered?" she asked, shaking her head. "By who?" Reeves hesitated, and that hesitation told Daniel everything he needed to know. "It was you," Daniel realized, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "You weren't just studying the environment, you were experimenting on the Panther." Reeves didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. He just exhaled slowly, his silence confirming everything. Emily's face twisted in horror. "Oh my God." Marcus muttered a curse under his breath, stepping away like Reeves was suddenly dangerous to be near. "You did something to it," he said, voice low and accusing. "And now you don't want us finding out what?" Reeves' face darkened. "You think I wanted this?" His voice was tight, edged with something close to desperation. "You think I meant for any of this to happen?" He gestured wildly toward the jungle, his movements too jerky, too strained. "I was forced to do it. And when I realized what I had done, what they had made me do, I tried to stop it. That's when they came for me." Daniel's heart pounded against his ribs. "Who?" Reeves took a shaky breath. "The people who took your vehicle. The people who left that note. The people who have been watching you since you set foot in this jungle." He stared at them, voice raw with warning. "They let you get this far because they want you to see what I did. But once you do, you won't leave here alive." A cold, suffocating silence fell over them, the weight of his words pressing down like an unbearable force. And then, just beyond the trees, something moved. A rustling, not like an animal, like footsteps. Reeves' expression shifted instantly. His eyes widened, his breath hitching, and before Daniel could react, Reeves lunged forward, grabbing his arm with a grip that was stronger than it should have been for someone so gaunt. "They're here," he whispered, urgency slicing through every word. "You have to run." But it was already too late. From the darkness, a single, deliberate beam of light flicked on. Not from a flashlight, from a scope. A red dot landed on Reeves' chest. And then the gunshot rang out. The gunshot ripped through the night, deafening in the suffocating silence of the jungle. For a second, Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe, his body frozen as Alan Reeves staggered backward, a sharp, choking gasp escaping his lips. His hands clutched at his chest, where the bullet had torn through flesh, a dark stain blooming across his already dirt-streaked shirt. He swayed unsteadily, his wide, panicked eyes locking onto Daniel's, as if trying to say something, trying to warn him finish this, before his knees buckled and he crumpled to the forest floor. Emily's strangled scream barely registered in Daniel's ears, as he instinctively ducked, yanking her down with him behind a thick tree trunk. Marcus had already moved, rifle raised, scanning the darkness for movement. But nothing came. No second shot. No voices. Just the eerie stillness of the jungle, thick with the heavy scent of blood and the distant hum of insects that hadn't even been disturbed by the kill. Whoever had fired wasn't in a hurry. They wanted them to feel this. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs, the reality of the situation crashing over him like a tidal wave. They had been watched from the beginning. Whoever these people were, whoever had forced Reeves into his sick experiments, had been tracking them, waiting for the right moment. And now, they had sent their first message: turn back, or die. Emily was shaking beside him, her breathing ragged, her nails digging into the damp earth, like she was trying to ground herself. Marcus still crouched low, hissed under his breath, his usual bravado cracking at the edges. "We need to move. Now." But Daniel couldn't move. Not yet. His eyes locked onto Reeves' body, motionless a few feet away, and something deep inside him clenched. The man had tried to warn them. He had risked everything to tell them the truth, whatever the hell that truth was. They couldn't just leave him here like an animal carcass left to rot. "Cover me," Daniel muttered, already shifting forward before Marcus could argue. He kept low, his muscles coiled, every instinct screaming at him to be ready for another shot. The beam of light from the sniper scope had disappeared, but that didn't mean the shooter was gone. It just meant they were waiting. When he reached Reeves, Daniel barely hesitated before gripping his collar and dragging him backward toward the trees. The dead weight made it slow, agonizingly so, but somehow he got the body behind cover. Emily pressed a hand over her mouth, tears streaking her face as she stared at the man who had, just minutes ago, been speaking to them, warning them. Now, his eyes were glassy, unseeing. Marcus let out a curse under his breath, scanning the trees again. "We need to go before we end up like him." Daniel's hands were shaking, but not from fear. From rage. His entire life had been dedicated to protecting animals, saving them from the worst of humanity's greed and cruelty. But this wasn't just about the Panther anymore. This was something deeper, something rooted in lies and manipulation, and Reeves had known. He had been at the center of it. And now he was dead before he could give them the whole truth. They weren't just running from poachers or smugglers. This was bigger. Someone with power, someone with resources, wanted this buried. And yet, even now, even with Reeves' blood still staining the ground, Daniel knew the real danger wasn't just the men in the shadows. It was the choice they had to make next. Marcus was right. If they stayed, They were dead. If they ran, they might make it out alive. Might. But if they left now, everything Reeves had tried to tell them, everything he had died for, would be lost. The Panther, the experiments, the truth about what had been done here, it would all disappear, erased like it had never happened. The weight of it settled over Daniel like a vice, crushing him from all sides. He had never faced a decision like this before. Every instinct screamed at him to survive, to get Emily out of here, to run before they suffered the same fate as Reeves. But he also knew, deep down, that running meant losing. It meant letting whoever was behind this win. Then, as if the universe itself wanted to twist the knife deeper, the radio on Daniel's belt crackled again. A burst of static, followed by a voice that shouldn't have been possible. Daniel. His blood ran cold. The voice was distant, distorted by the interference, but unmistakable. It was Reeves. Emily gasped, her head snapping toward the radio in disbelief. Marcus went rigid, his hand tightening around his rifle. But Daniel could only stare at the small device, his breath trapped in his chest. Reeves was dead. He was lying right in front of them, lifeless, the bullet wound in his chest proof of that fact. And yet, his voice was coming through the radio, quiet, weak. But there. "You don't understand," the voice said. A whisper, like it was coming from the other side of something too vast, too impossible to reach. "It's not about the Panther. It was never about the Panther." Static swallowed the words. Then silence. Emily let out a sharp, broken breath. Marcus shook his head, stepping back like he could distance himself from what had just happened. "No," he muttered. "No, this is some kind of trick." Daniel's heart pounded, his mind racing through the possibilities, but none of them made sense. The radio was old, outdated, with no recorded transmission capabilities. This wasn't playback. This wasn't interference. This was something else. Daniel swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the radio. He had made his decision. There was no turning back now. They weren't running. They were seeing this through to the end. Daniel barely had time to process the impossible voice on the radio before the jungle erupted into chaos. A second gunshot rang out closer this time, shattering the suffocating silence. Marcus cursed, grabbing Emily by the arm and dragging her deeper into the undergrowth as Daniel lunged for cover behind a fallen tree. The sniper wasn't just playing with them anymore. This was execution. They were being hunted. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't Reeves' voice. It was someone else. A man. Cold, controlled, and unmistakably real. "You were warned." The breath left Daniel's lungs like he'd been punched. The voice wasn't distorted, wasn't some eerie echo of the past. It was alive, present, and terrifyingly certain. Whoever this was, they were close. Too close. And they had no intention of letting them leave the jungle alive. Emily was shaking, her fingers digging into Marcus's sleeve, but her eyes were locked onto Daniel. She was waiting for him to decide what came next. But he had no answers, just a gut-deep certainty that they had wandered into something much bigger than a sick panther or a missing scientist. Another gunshot. Closer. Splintering wood just inches from his head. They had seconds. Maybe less. Daniel took a breath, forcing his brain to push past the shock, the fear, the gnawing sense that they had already lost. He needed a plan. Now. "We can't stay here," he whispered, his voice raw. "We move, we split up different directions, different targets. They won't be able to track all of us at once." Marcus hesitated, his fingers twitching on his rifle. He hated splitting up. So did Daniel. But right now, there were no good choices. Only survival. Emily was the first to nod. She wasn't built for this, none of them were, but she understood what was at stake. "We regroup at the river," she said, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. "If we're not there in 20 minutes, we keep moving." Daniel met Marcus's gaze. "You good?" Marcus exhaled sharply, then gave a tight nod. "Yeah. Just don't get yourself killed." Then they ran. Daniel moved fast, keeping low, weaving through the thick vegetation as the darkness swallowed him whole. The gunfire stopped. No more warning shots. No more playing. That meant only one thing. The men in the jungle weren't just watching anymore. They were following. Branches whipped against his arms as he pushed forward, adrenaline dulling the sting. He counted every second, every breath, every sound. His senses sharpened, every instinct screaming for survival. He had spent years tracking animals, reading the land, learning how predators hunted their prey. Now, for the first time, he was the prey. Somewhere behind him, something snapped a twig, a footstep, deliberate and wrong. He spun just in time to see the shadow moving between the trees. Not Marcus. Not Emily. Someone else. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He had no weapon except his hunting knife, no cover except the darkness. He forced himself to stay still, heart hammering, lungs burning. The figure moved slowly, methodically, scanning the jungle with trained precision. They weren't searching at random. They knew he was here. And then, the figure spoke. "You should have left this alone, Daniel." The voice was familiar. Too familiar. A cold wave of realization slammed into him as the man stepped forward into the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. Marcus. Daniel felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. His best friend, the man he had trusted with his life, the man who had just stood beside him as they ran for cover, was standing here now, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. For a split second, Daniel's brain refused to accept what he was seeing. Maybe it was a trick. Maybe it was someone else, someone wearing Marcus's gear, mimicking his voice. But no, it was him. Marcus sighed, shaking his head, his grip tightening on the rifle. "I tried to keep you out of this, man. I really did." Daniel's hands clenched into fists, his mind racing. "You set us up," he said, his voice rough, edged with something dangerously close to fury. "You were working with them this whole time." Marcus didn't deny it. Didn't even try to make excuses. "It was never supposed to get this far," he admitted, his voice tired, almost regretful. "We were supposed to come in, find nothing, leave empty-handed. But then you wouldn't stop digging." And Reeves, he shook his head. "That idiot got himself killed because he thought he could change the outcome." Daniel's stomach twisted. "So, what now?" he demanded. "You kill me too? You shoot Emily? You make sure we disappear just like Reeves?" Marcus hesitated. Just for a second. And that hesitation told Daniel everything. There was still a way out of this. Daniel took a slow step back, his heart pounding against his ribs. "You don't have to do this." Marcus's jaw clenched, and for the first time, a flicker of something almost human crossed his face. Regret? Guilt? Maybe. But then, in an instant, it was gone. "You were my best friend," Marcus said quietly. "But some things are bigger than friendship." And then, without warning, he raised his rifle. Daniel moved before he could think. Years of instinct, of survival, of knowing exactly how to react in the face of danger kicked in all at once. He dropped low, just as Marcus fired, the bullet ripping through the space where his head had been a fraction of a second before. Then Daniel ran. Branches snapped around him, gunfire slicing through the air as he tore through the jungle, his mind racing faster than his feet. Marcus had betrayed them. Marcus had been the threat all along. But he wasn't working alone. He had orders. He had a mission. And that meant someone else was calling the shots. Someone bigger. Someone who had been pulling the strings from the very beginning. Daniel didn't stop running. Didn't look back. He had 20 minutes to get to the river. 20 minutes to figure out who was really behind this. and 20 minutes to decide if he was willing to do what had to be done to stop them. The river was closer now, the distant roar of rushing water breaking through the tangled whispers of the jungle, but Daniel barely registered it. His mind was a storm, his lungs burning as he pushed forward, forcing himself to stay ahead of Marcus, ahead of the men hunting them, ahead of the moment he would have to face what he already knew was coming. His best friend had betrayed him, and if he hesitated for even a second, Marcus would kill him. The moonlight barely cut through the thick canopy, leaving the jungle shrouded in shadows. But Daniel moved like an animal now, instinct sharper than thought. He had spent years tracking predators, understanding how they hunted, how they thought. And now, for the first time, he had to be one. Because Marcus wasn't just a hunter, he was a soldier. And he wouldn't stop until Daniel was dead. A gunshot cracked through the night, and Daniel ducked just in time, feeling the heat of the bullet as it shattered a branch inches from his head. He veered left, slipping through a cluster of roots and underbrush, moving low, fast, unpredictable. The river was his only chance. If he could make it to the water, he could disappear, regroup with Emily if she was still alive. The thought sent a fresh surge of rage through him. Marcus had stood beside them, laughed with them, pretended to be their friend, while he led them into a trap. But he wasn't just following orders. Daniel had seen the look in his eyes before he pulled the trigger. Marcus had made his choice. And now Daniel had to make his. He burst into a clearing just as another shot rang out. This time, he wasn't fast enough. Fire lanced through his shoulder as the bullet tore through flesh, sending him stumbling forward. He barely caught himself, the pain sharp and blinding, but he forced himself to move, to push forward. Not now. Not here. Then, just ahead, he saw her. Emily. She was standing at the riverbank, panting, gripping a gun with shaky hands. Her eyes widened when she saw him, then darted past him, locking onto someone behind him. Daniel didn't turn. He didn't have to. He already knew. Slow, measured footsteps crunched against the damp earth. And then Marcus spoke. "You're done, man. Drop it." Daniel let out a harsh breath, his mind racing. His arm was numb, blood soaking his sleeve, but he ignored it. He still had his knife, his body, his anger. He turned slowly, facing Marcus, who stood a few yards away, rifle raised, eyes cold, unreadable. The moonlight carved harsh angles into his face, making him look like a stranger, like someone Daniel had never known at all. "Why?" Daniel's voice was rough, raw. "Why do this? Why betray us?" Marcus exhaled, his grip tightening on the rifle. "It was never about you." He glanced at Emily, his expression unreadable. "Or her. This was bigger than both of you. Bigger than Reeves. Bigger than the damn Panther." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Then tell me. If you're gonna kill me, at least let me know what was worth all this." Marcus hesitated, just for a second. And Daniel saw it, that flicker of something deep, buried beneath the soldier, beneath the mask. Doubt. Then, Marcus spoke. The Panther was a test. A trial run. The parasites, the sickness, it wasn't natural. His voice was calm, too calm. It was manufactured, engineered. The people funding this, whoever they are, they're testing something bigger. If it worked on the Panther, the next step was humans. Daniel's blood ran cold. "You're lying." Marcus shook his head. "I wish I was." The words landed like a hammer. Daniel had been prepared for poachers, for smugglers, even for mercenaries, willing to kill to keep a secret. But this was something else, something worse. Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "They're testing bioweapons." Marcus didn't answer, but the silence was enough. Daniel's hands curled into fists. "And you helped them?" Marcus's expression darkened. "You think you're the only one who cares about the truth? You think I wanted any of this?" His voice cracked, just slightly. I was supposed to make sure no one found out. But then you wouldn't let it go. And now, I have to finish this." The rifle came up. Daniel moved. Pain ripped through his shoulder as he lunged forward, closing the distance before Marcus could fire. He grabbed the barrel of the rifle, forcing it upward as the shot rang out, then slammed his knee into Marcus's ribs. The impact sent them both crashing into the dirt, rolling, grappling for control. Marcus was strong, trained, but Daniel was desperate. They fought like animals, fists slamming into flesh, blood mixing with sweat and dirt. Daniel's knife flashed, but Marcus knocked it away, driving an elbow into his wounded shoulder. Daniel choked back a scream as pain exploded through his body, but he refused to go down. He refused to lose. Then suddenly, Marcus was on top of him, hands around his throat, pressing down, squeezing. Stars burst behind Daniel's eyes. He clawed at Marcus's grip, his lungs burning, the edges of the world going dark. And then bang. Marcus jerked violently, his grip loosening. His body tensed, then slumped, collapsing sideways. Daniel gasped, sucking in air as he scrambled back, his vision swimming. He looked up. Emily stood there, gun still raised, her hands trembling. Smoke curled from the barrel. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Marcus coughed a wet, broken sound. He was still alive. Barely. His eyes flickered toward Emily, then to Daniel. He tried to speak, but only blood came. His chest rose once, then fell. And didn't rise again. Emily let out a sharp, broken breath, lowering the gun, her entire body shaking. "I had to," she whispered. "I had to." Daniel swallowed hard, his chest heaving. "I know." The river roared beside them, uncaring. The jungle was silent. And then, from somewhere deep in the darkness, the radio on Marcus's belt crackled to life. A voice smooth and measured filled the night. Well, that was unexpected. Daniel's stomach twisted. The real mastermind, the one pulling the strings, was still out there. Watching. Waiting. And this wasn't over. The jungle never forgot. It bore witness to everything: the blood spilled, the secrets buried, the ghosts that would never leave. As the first light of dawn seeped through the tangled canopy, Daniel sat near the riverbank, his wounded shoulder wrapped in a torn piece of his own shirt, his body aching with exhaustion. He hadn't moved in hours, staring at the place where Marcus had fallen, where everything had changed. The body was gone now, washed away by the current, swallowed whole by the river, as if the jungle itself had erased him. Maybe that was fitting. Maybe Marcus had belonged to the shadows all along. Emily sat nearby, silent, hugging her knees to her chest. She hadn't spoken since it happened, since she had pulled the trigger. Her face was pale, her hands still stained with Marcus's blood, but there was no relief in her eyes. Only the weight of what they had done. What they had survived. But survival wasn't victory. Not when they had seen what they had seen. Not when the truth was still out there, waiting. The radio that had crackled to life just hours ago now lay between them, silent once more. Whoever had spoken, whoever had been behind this, hadn't reached out again. But that voice, calm and composed, had left something behind. A promise. This isn't over. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the river fill the silence between them. He wanted to believe it was over, that Marcus had been the end of it. But deep down, he knew better. Marcus was just another pawn, just another soldier following orders. The real players, the ones who had created the parasites, who had tested their experiments on something as untouchable as the jungle's most feared predator, they were still out there. Watching. Waiting. And now, they knew Daniel was still alive. He thought about Reeves, about the look in the scientist's eyes, when he had tried to warn them, when he had died for the truth. He thought about the Black Panther, sick and suffering, a victim of something bigger than it could ever understand. It was never about poaching, never about conservation. The jungle had just been a testing ground, a controlled experiment, and if it had worked here, the next step was unthinkable. Emily shifted beside him, drawing her knees closer. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, distant. "We can't go back, can we?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He thought about what that meant, what waiting for them outside the jungle would look like. Their old lives were gone. The moment they stepped into civilization again, everything would change. There would be questions, investigations, headlines. Maybe someone would try to silence them. Maybe someone already had a plan in place. But silence wasn't an option. Not anymore. "No," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "We can't." She nodded slowly, like she had already known the answer. "Then what do we do?" Daniel exhaled, glancing at the radio one last time, before rising to his feet. His body protested the movement, every wound, every bruise reminding him of how close he had come to dying here. But he wasn't dead, and that had to mean something. "We go public," he said. "We tell them what we saw. We don't stop until someone listens." Emily looked up at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "And if no one listens?" Daniel held her gaze, jaw tightening. He already knew what would happen then. He had seen too much, lost too much. If no one listened, they would have to find another way. Then, from somewhere in the dense jungle, a sound broke the stillness. A low, rumbling growl. Both of them turned sharply, their bodies tensing. And then, emerging from the trees, moving like a shadow between the streaks of golden morning light, it appeared. The panther. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had been sure it was dead. After everything, after the sickness, after Marcus, after the fire and blood and gunshots, he had thought the jungle had claimed the creature like it had claimed everything else. But now, here it was. Alive. Scarred but standing, its dark coat rippling with power, its golden eyes locked onto his. The parasite should have killed it. The experiment should have won. But it hadn't. The panther had survived. Daniel and the animal stared at each other for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. A shared understanding. A promise. Then, without a sound, the panther turned and vanished into the jungle once more. Daniel let out a slow breath, his chest tight. Maybe survival was victory. Maybe the jungle wasn't done fighting yet, and neither was he.